The transport shuttle shuddered as it descended through the thick atmosphere of Glacialis Prime, a frozen world on the outer rim of the Galactic Education Consortium's territory. Marcus Chun pressed his face against the viewport, watching the endless expanse of ice and snow stretch toward the horizon. As one of only 3 humans accepted into the prestigious Xenobiology Advanced Studies program, he felt the weight of representing his entire species. "Fascinating, isn't it?" came a melodic voice beside him. Marcus turned to see Zira, a Kepler student with crystalline blue skin and, for delicate arms. Her species thrived in cold environments, making her perfectly suited for this field expedition. Professor Vextai chose this location specifically for its extreme conditions. He believes adversity reveals true scientific potential. Marcus nodded, though something about the way she said it made him uneasy. Professor Vextai was a crystalline, an ancient race known for their rigid thinking and obsession with testing limits. Their educational methods were legendary throughout the galaxy, though not always for positive reasons. The shuttle touched down with a mechanical thud on a landing platform carved into solid ice. Through the viewport, Marcus could see towering ice formations and deep crevasses that disappeared into darkness. The wind howled across the barren landscape, creating an eerie symphony that seemed to welcome them to this frozen prison. "Students, gather your equipment." Professor Vextai's voice crackled through the intercom. His tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "We will be conducting our research in the natural laboratory I have prepared for you. This expedition will separate the truly dedicated from the merely curious." Marcus shouldered his pack, which contained standard-issue research tools, emergency rations for 3 days, and basic survival gear. The other students did the same, their various species each carrying equipment suited to their physiologies. There were 12 students total representing 8 different species, but Marcus noticed he was the only human. The airlock hissed open, and immediately the brutal cold hit them like a physical blow. Even through his thermal suit, Marcus felt the temperature trying to leach the warmth from his body. His breath came out in thick clouds that froze almost instantly. The other students seemed better adapted to the conditions, particularly Zira and 2 other Cold World species. Professor Vextai emerged from the shuttle's crew compartment, his tall, angular frame moving with predatory grace. His species resembled living crystal formations, with faceted skin that caught and refracted light in mesmerizing patterns. His eyes were like frozen diamonds, showing no warmth or emotion as they surveyed his students. "Follow me," he commanded, turning toward a narrow passage carved into the ice cliff face. "Your real education begins now." They walked single file through the winding passage, their footsteps echoing off the crystalline walls. Emergency lighting had been installed at regular intervals, casting an eerie blue glow that made the ice seem alive. Marcus noticed that the passage sloped steadily downward, leading them deeper into the planet's frozen crust. After 20 minutes of walking, they emerged into a vast cavern system that took Marcus's breath away. The space was enormous, with an arched ceiling that disappeared into shadows high above. Massive ice columns stretched from floor to ceiling like frozen trees in an alien forest. Strange ice formations covered every surface, creating a landscape that seemed more like an alien cathedral than a natural cave. "Welcome to your laboratory," Professor Vextai announced, his voice echoing in the vast space. "This cavern system extends for kilometers in every direction. You will spend the next 72 hours here, conducting independent research on the unique ice formations and mineral deposits." Marcus looked around nervously. The cavern was beautiful but felt utterly isolated from any form of civilization. "Professor, what about emergency protocols? Communication with the surface?" The crystalline's diamond eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made him step backward. "Young human, you concern yourself with safety rather than knowledge. This is why your species remains confined to such a small portion of the galaxy. You fear to push boundaries." Several alien students made sounds that Marcus recognized as laughter in their respective languages. He felt heat rise in his cheeks despite the freezing temperature. Throughout his academic career, he had faced constant skepticism about human capabilities. Most galactic species viewed humans as primitive newcomers with limited potential. Your research assignments are in your data tablets. Professor Vextai continued, distributing devices to each student. You will work independently to catalog and analyze the formations in your assigned sectors. Collaboration is forbidden. This is a test of individual capability. Marcus accepted his tablet and saw that he had been assigned to explore a particularly narrow section of the cavern system that extended deep into the ice. The area looked treacherous and isolated, far from where the other students would be working. Professor, called out Gexka, a reptilian student from a desert world who was already shivering despite his thermal gear. The temperature readings show this environment is below safe operational limits for several of our species. Shouldn't we establish a heated base camp? Professor Vextai's crystalline features shifted into what might have been a smile, though it looked more like a crack in a glacier. Adaptation is the cornerstone of evolution, young Gexka. If you cannot function in challenging conditions, perhaps advanced xenobiology is not your calling. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something about this situation felt wrong. The professor's dismissive attitude towards safety concerns, the isolated location, the prohibition against collaboration. It all seemed designed to create maximum stress rather than optimal learning conditions. You have your assignments, Professor Vextai announced. Begin your work immediately. I will return in 72 hours to collect your research and evaluate your progress. Do not disappoint me. Before any student could respond, the crystalline professor turned and walked back toward the passage they had entered through. His footsteps echoed in the vast space, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. The students were left alone in the frozen cathedral, surrounded by tons of ice and separated from civilization by kilometers of solid rock. Did he just leave us here? Whispered Jaxa, a feline-like species whose fur was already frosted with ice crystals. Without any way to contact the surface? Marcus pulled out his communication device and checked for signals. Nothing. The thick ice and rock were blocking all transmissions. He looked at the other students and saw the same realization dawning on their faces. They were completely cut off from the outside world. Zira, who had seemed confident during the shuttle ride, now looked uncertain. The professor must know what he's doing. The crystallines are renowned educators. This is probably just part of the test. But Marcus wasn't convinced. He had studied human history extensively, and this situation reminded him of too many stories where authority figures had used isolation and stress to break down their subjects. His instincts, honed by millions of years of human evolution, were screaming warnings. We should stay together, Marcus suggested. Regardless of the assignment restrictions, it's safer if we work in groups. The professor specifically forbade collaboration, Zira replied, though her voice lacked conviction. We could be disqualified from the program for violating direct orders. Marcus looked around at the other students. Some seemed eager to begin their individual assignments, particularly those from species that prided themselves on following authority. Others appeared as uncertain as he felt. Gexka was already showing signs of hypothermia despite his thermal gear, and 2 other warm-world species were in similar conditions. Listen, Marcus said, raising his voice to address the group. I understand the importance of following instructions, but our first priority should be survival. If something happens to any of us, we need to be able to help each other. The human speaks wisdom, rumbled Torjin, a massive student whose species resembled living rock formations. My people value honor and following orders, but we also value the lives of those who share our struggles. The group began to divide along philosophical lines. The more authoritarian species insisted on following Professor Vextai's instructions exactly, while others agreed with Marcus that safety should come first. The debate might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by a sound that chilled Marcus to his bones. A deep rumbling echoed through the cavern, followed by a grinding noise like massive gears turning. The sound came from the direction of the passage they had entered through. Marcus ran toward the entrance with several other students close behind, their footsteps slipping on the icy floor. What they found made Marcus's worst fears come true. A massive ice barrier had descended across the passage entrance, sealing them completely inside the cavern. The barrier was at least 2 meters thick and appeared to be solid ice reinforced with metal supports. It had been engineered specifically to trap them. No, 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 Gexka whispered, pressing his scaled hands against the barrier. This cannot be happening. This must be a mistake. Marcus examined the barrier carefully, running his hands along its surface. It was perfectly smooth except for a small viewing port at eye level. Through the thick glass, he could see the passage beyond, but there was no way to reach it. The barrier was clearly designed to be permanent. It's no mistake, Marcus said grimly. We've been imprisoned here deliberately. The other students gathered around the barrier, some still refusing to believe what was happening. Zira's crystalline skin had lost its lustrous sheen, taking on a dull, frightened appearance. Professor Vextai wouldn't do this. He's a respected educator. There must be an explanation. Marcus turned to face the group, seeing the fear and denial in their alien faces. Whatever the explanation, our situation hasn't changed. We're trapped in here with limited supplies, no communication with the outside, and no way to know if or when that barrier will be opened. The full impact of their situation began to sink in. They had food for 3 days at most, and the cavern's temperature was well below what most of the species could survive long-term. Several students were already showing signs of hypothermia, and their thermal gear was designed for temporary exposure, not extended survival. We need to take inventory of our supplies and find the warmest area of the cavern, Marcus continued. Then, we need to figure out a way to either get warm enough to survive or find a way out of here. The human thinks he can lead us, scoffed Quintar, a proud avian species known for their arrogance. His species has barely mastered interplanetary travel. What could he possibly know about survival in extreme conditions? Marcus felt the familiar sting of species-based discrimination, but he pushed the emotion aside. I know that we're all going to die in here if we don't work together. My species may be young in galactic terms, but we've survived in every environment on our home planet. We know something about adaptation and survival. The argument was interrupted by a weak cry from across the cavern. They turned to see that Gexka had collapsed, his reptilian body unable to cope with the extreme cold. Several students rushed to his side, but it was clear that he needed immediate medical attention and warming that they couldn't provide with their current resources. As Marcus knelt beside the fallen student, checking his vital signs, he realized that this was exactly what Professor Vextai had wanted. The crystalline had deliberately put them in an impossible situation to see how they would react. It was an experiment in survival, with the students as unwilling test subjects. But Professor Vextai had made one critical error in his calculations. He had underestimated human ingenuity and the fierce determination that had driven Marcus's species to spread across the stars despite being relative newcomers to galactic civilization. Humans had a reputation for finding solutions where none seemed to exist, for refusing to give up even when faced with impossible odds. Marcus looked around the frozen cavern, his mind already working on the problem. Ice and stone, limited supplies, extreme cold. To most species, this would seem like an unsolvable death trap. But Marcus was human, and humans had been solving impossible problems since they first learned to make fire in the depths of Earth's ice ages. The game was on, and Professor Vextai was about to learn what human creativity could accomplish when driven by necessity and fueled by the unbreakable will to survive. Marcus knelt beside Gexka's unconscious form, his mind racing through possibilities. The reptilian student's body temperature was dropping rapidly, and without immediate intervention, hypothermia would claim his life within hours. Around them, the other students stood helplessly, their advanced alien educations providing no solutions for their current predicament. We need to get him warm, now, Marcus announced, pulling off his own thermal jacket despite the protests from Zira and others. Someone help me strip him out of his wet thermal gear. Dampness will kill him faster than the cold. As they worked to remove Gexka's frozen clothing, Marcus's mind was already moving to the larger problem. The cavern was a death trap, but death traps could be escaped if you understood the physics involved. Humans had survived ice ages, Arctic expeditions, and countless other situations where technology failed and only ingenuity remained. Torjin, Marcus called to the rock-like student whose species was more resistant to temperature extremes. I need you to help me gather materials. We're going to build a furnace. The massive alien student lumbered over, Is stone-like features showing skepticism? Young human, with what materials? This cavern contains only ice and stone. Your species may be resourceful, but even you cannot create fire from nothing. Marcus stood up, looking around the cavern with fresh eyes. Where others saw an impossible situation, he was beginning to see opportunities. That's where you're wrong. We have everything we need. We just need to think differently about how to use it. He pulled out his data tablet and began taking readings of the cavern's composition and structure. The ice formations weren't uniform. Some sections contained air bubbles and impurities, while others were clear and dense. The mineral deposits scattered throughout the cavern included metals that could conduct heat, and the emergency lighting system meant there was a power source somewhere. The emergency lighting, Marcus muttered, examining the nearest light fixture. Zira, your species understands crystalline structures better than anyone. Can you help me figure out how these lights are powered? The Kepler student approached hesitantly, her 4 delicate arms moving gracefully as she examined the lighting system. The power source appears to be a standard thermal conversion unit. It draws heat from the surrounding environment and converts it to electrical energy. Very efficient for cold weather installations. Marcus nodded, the pieces of his plan beginning to fall into place. So it's extracting heat from the environment. What if we could reverse that process? Make it generate heat instead of consuming it. That's theoretically possible, Zira said slowly, but it would require rewiring the entire system. And even if we succeeded, the amount of heat would be minimal. Not necessarily, Marcus replied, his excitement growing as the solution crystallized in his mind. We don't need to heat the entire cavern. We just need to create enough localized heat to keep us alive and give us time to work on a bigger solution. He turned to address the group, many of whom were now showing signs of serious cold exposure. Listen, everyone. We're going to split into teams. Torjin and I are going to work on creating a heat source. Zira, I need you to use your knowledge of crystalline structures to help us identify the best materials to work with. The rest of you need to gather insulation materials and create a shelter in the warmest part of the cavern. Who made you the leader? Quintar demanded, his avian features ruffled with indignation. Your species has no authority over the rest of us. Marcus felt his patience wearing thin, but he forced himself to remain calm. Lives were at stake, and ego battles would only cost precious time. I'm not trying to be anyone's leader. I'm trying to solve a problem that's going to kill all of us if we don't act quickly. If you have a better plan, I'm all ears. The avian student glared at him, but said nothing. Marcus could see the fear behind the arrogance. Quintar's species was adapted for flight in temperate atmospheres, making them particularly vulnerable in this environment. Jaxa, Marcus called to the feline student, whose fur was now heavily frosted. Your species has excellent night vision and hearing. Can you scout the cavern and find the most sheltered area? Somewhere with natural windbreaks and maybe some thermal advantages. The cat-like alien nodded gratefully, seeming relieved to have a purpose. She bounded away into the shadows with surprising grace despite the cold. Marcus turned his attention to the emergency lighting system, working with Torjin to carefully remove one of the thermal conversion units. The device was more complex than he had hoped, but the basic principles were similar to technology he had studied on Earth. The challenge, he explained to Torjin as they worked, is that this unit is designed to extract heat very efficiently. We need to reverse the process without destroying the delicate components. Torjin's rocky hands were surprisingly gentle as he helped manipulate the small parts. My species builds with stone and metal. We understand the flow of energy through solid materials. Perhaps we can redirect the thermal flow rather than reversing it entirely. Marcus paused in his work, considering the suggestion. That's brilliant. Instead of trying to make it generate heat, we concentrate the heat it's already extracting from one area into a smaller space. Like a thermal lens. Working together, they began to modify the device, using tools from their research kits and materials scavenged from around the cavern. It was delicate work made more difficult by their numb fingers and the constant threat of hypothermia. But Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction of solving a complex problem through applied ingenuity. Meanwhile, Zira had identified several promising mineral deposits that could serve as heat conductors. Her species' natural understanding of crystal lattices allowed her to predict which materials would be most effective at concentrating and directing thermal energy. These iron-nickel formations, she reported, pointing to dark veins running through the ice walls, should conduct heat very efficiently. If we can extract enough and incorporate it into your heating device, we might be able to create a functional warming system. The extraction process was laborious and dangerous. Using their research tools as improvised mining equipment, they chipped away at the frozen metal deposits, working in shifts to prevent any individual from becoming too exhausted or cold to continue. JAXA returned from her scouting mission with encouraging news. There's a smaller chamber about 50 meters north, she reported, her feline tail twitching with excitement despite her obvious discomfort. It's partially enclosed and has several thermal vents that seem to emit slightly warmer air. Thermal vents. Marcus looked up from his work with the heating device. Are you sure? Positive. The air movement is definitely warmer than the ambient temperature, and there's a distinctive mineral smell that suggests geothermal activity. Marcus felt a surge of hope. If there were natural thermal vents in the cavern system, it meant there was a source of heat deep in the planet's crust. With the right modifications, they might be able to tap into that geothermal energy. Change of plans, he announced. We move everything to that chamber. If we can access geothermal heat, we can create a much more effective warming system. The relocation was difficult, especially with Gexka still unconscious and requiring constant care. But the smaller chamber proved to be everything JAXA had promised. It was more sheltered from the wind currents that flowed through the main cavern, and Marcus could feel the slight temperature difference immediately. More importantly, he could see the thermal vents JAXA had discovered. They were small fissures in the ice floor where warmer air rose from deep underground. The temperature differential wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to work with. Torjen, I need you to help me widen one of these vents, Marcus said, examining the fissures. We're going to create a natural chimney effect to draw more warm air from below. The rock-like alien nodded and began carefully chipping away at the ice around the largest vent. His species' natural strength and understanding of stone and ice made him perfect for the task. As he worked, Marcus could see the warm air flow increasing, carrying with it the mineral scents that indicated significant thermal activity below. While Torjen widened the vent, Marcus worked on creating a heat amplification system using the modified thermal converter and the metal they had extracted. The principle was similar to a solar concentrator, but instead of focusing sunlight, it would concentrate the geothermal heat rising from the vents. This is actually quite elegant, Zero observed, watching Marcus work. You're using the planet's own thermal energy against the imprisonment that Professor Vextai created. Marcus paused in his work, considering her words. That's exactly what we're doing. The professor thought he could trap us in a frozen hell, but he forgot that even the coldest worlds have warm hearts. We just need to find a way to reach them. The heating system came together slowly, requiring constant adjustments and problem-solving as each component was integrated with the others. Marcus found himself drawing on knowledge from multiple disciplines, physics, engineering, geology, even some basic chemistry as they worked to optimize the thermal exchange process. Hours passed as they labored, their hands growing increasingly numb despite their makeshift heating system. But, gradually, Marcus could feel the air temperature in their small chamber beginning to rise. It wasn't warm by any comfortable standard, but it was above the life-threatening levels they had faced in the main cavern. Gexka began to stir as warmth slowly returned to his reptilian body. His first words were a weak expression of gratitude that brought tears to several students' eyes, tears that didn't freeze immediately in the gradually warming air. The heating system is working, Marcus announced to the group, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. We're no longer in immediate danger of freezing to death, but this is just the beginning. We need to find a way out of here. Quintar, who had remained skeptical throughout the entire process, finally admitted grudging respect. I confess, human, your species' approach to problem-solving is unconventional but effective. My people pride themselves on technological superiority, but we would not have thought to combine so many different principles in such a creative manner. Marcus nodded his acknowledgement, but was already thinking ahead to their next challenge. They had solved the immediate problem of survival, but they were still trapped in the cavern with limited food and no communication with the outside world. The heating system bought them time, but time was meaningless without a plan for escape. As he looked around at the other students, aliens from across the galaxy who had initially dismissed human capabilities, Marcus realized something profound had changed. They were no longer looking at him as the primitive representative of a backward species. They were looking at him as someone who had proven that survival often depended more on creativity and determination than on technological advancement or ancient wisdom. The next phase of their ordeal would test those qualities even further, but for the first time since Professor Vextai had abandoned them in the frozen cavern, Marcus felt confident that they would find a way out. Humans had survived worse situations than this, and they had done it through exactly the kind of improvisation and refusal to give up that had gotten them this far. The real test was just beginning. The makeshift heating system hummed quietly in their sheltered chamber, its improvised components working in harmony to keep the deadly cold at bay. Marcus had managed only a few hours of sleep, but his mind was already racing with plans for their escape. Around him, his fellow students huddled close to the thermal vents, their alien forms finally showing signs of recovery from the hypothermia that had nearly claimed several lives. Gexka, now conscious and able to speak, had become one of Marcus's strongest advocates. "The humans saved my life," he declared to anyone who would listen. "His species may be young, but they understand survival in ways the rest of us have forgotten." Marcus appreciated the support, but he was more focused on the ice barrier that sealed their prison. During the night, he had studied the structure extensively, using his data tablet to analyze its composition and construction. What he had discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. "The barrier isn't just ice," he announced to the group as they gathered around the heating system for a council of war. "It's a sophisticated containment system. There are metal reinforcements throughout the structure, and it's connected to some kind of monitoring system." Zira's crystalline features reflected the warm glow of their heating system as she processed this information. "You mean Professor Vextai is watching us?" "Almost certainly," Marcus replied. "This isn't just an educational exercise gone wrong. It's a deliberate experiment, and we're the test subjects." The implications sank in slowly. If the professor was monitoring them, it meant their imprisonment was intentional and ongoing. He wasn't coming back to release them after 72 hours. He was waiting to see how they would react to extreme stress and isolation. "But why?" asked Jaxa, her feline features showing confusion and hurt. "We're his students. We trusted him." Marcus had been thinking about that question all night. "Because we represent different species from across the galaxy." He's studying how various alien physiologies and psychologies respond to life-threatening stress. It's the ultimate xenobiology experiment, using live subjects instead of laboratory specimens. The anger in the chamber was palpable. Even the most authority-respecting species among them were horrified by the betrayal of academic trust. But Marcus knew that anger alone wouldn't get them out of their prison. "The good news," he continued, "is that if he's monitoring us, it means there's a way for information to get in and out of this cavern. That suggests there might be ways for us to get out too." Torgen's rocky features shifted thoughtfully. "You believe there are other passages? Hidden exits that the professor doesn't expect us to find?" "I think there's something better," Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "I think we can create our own exit." The group fell silent as Marcus pulled up the geological scans he had been studying. The data showed the cavern's position relative to the surface and the thermal activity deep underground. Most importantly, it revealed something that Professor Vextai had either overlooked or underestimated. "Look at this thermal signature," Marcus said, pointing to a section of the scan that showed intense heat activity about 20 meters below their current position. "There's a massive geothermal chamber down there, probably connected to an underground hot spring system. The heat we've been tapping into is just the overflow from something much larger." Zira studied the data with her species' expert understanding of mineral structures. "The ice layer between us and that chamber is relatively thin. But, Marcus, even if we could somehow reach it, how would that help us escape?" Marcus smiled. the expression looking almost predatory in the warm glow of their heating system. Because I'm not planning to just reach it. I'm planning to release it. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. Marcus was proposing to deliberately break through to an underground geothermal chamber, flooding their prison with superheated water and steam that would melt their way to the surface. It was dangerous, potentially catastrophic, and absolutely brilliant. You want to create an artificial geyser, Torjin said slowly, understanding dawning in his rocky features. Use the planet's own thermal energy to carve our escape route. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. But it has to be controlled. Too little, and we just flood the chamber with scalding water. Too much, and we create an explosion that brings down the entire cavern system. The engineering challenges were immense. They would need to precisely calculate the thermal dynamics, create a controlled breach in the ice floor, and channel the resulting eruption in exactly the right direction. One mistake would mean death for all of them. But, as Marcus began outlining his plan in detail, the other students found themselves caught up in his infectious confidence. Here was a human who refused to accept defeat, who looked at an impossible situation and saw opportunity instead of obstacles. We'll need to reinforce this chamber to protect us from the initial thermal surge, Marcus explained, sketching diagrams on his data tablet. Then, we'll create a controlled channel that directs the geyser effect upward through the weakest point in the cavern ceiling. Jax's ears perked up with excitement. I found several areas where the ceiling ice looks thinner during my scouting. There are natural stress points where thermal expansion could create cracks. Perfect, Marcus replied. We'll use those as our target points. Torjin, I'll need your species' expertise with stone and ice to help calculate the structural dynamics. Zira, your understanding of crystalline formation will be crucial for predicting how the ice will behave under thermal stress. Even Quintar, the proud avian who had initially dismissed human capabilities, found himself drawn into the planning. My species has extensive knowledge of atmospheric pressure dynamics from our flight capabilities. I could help calculate the pressure differentials needed to create a controlled eruption. As the planning session continued, Marcus realized something remarkable was happening. The artificial crisis that Professor Vextai had created to study species interactions was having the opposite effect of what the crystalline had probably intended. Instead of breaking down into chaos and conflict, the diverse group of students was learning to combine their unique capabilities in unprecedented ways. We'll need to work in carefully timed phases, Marcus continued. First, we create the thermal collection system to concentrate heat from the geothermal chamber below. Then, we'll carefully weaken the ice floor in a controlled pattern. Finally, we'll trigger the breach and ride the resulting geyser to freedom. The execution of the plan began immediately. Using their research tools as improvised construction equipment, they began building a heat concentrator system that would focus geothermal energy on specific points in the ice floor. It was painstaking work that required constant adjustments as they learned to work with materials and forces they had never encountered before. Marcus found himself thinking about human history as they labored. His species had always been defined by their refusal to accept limitations. When early humans faced ice ages, they didn't simply endure. They developed new technologies and strategies that allowed them to thrive. When they encountered seemingly impossible natural barriers, they found ways to turn those barriers into opportunities. The thermal concentration is working, Zira reported after several hours of careful calibration. We're seeing temperature increases of over 40 degrees at the target points. The ice is beginning to show stress fractures. Marcus peered down at the carefully controlled breach points they had created. He could see steam beginning to rise from the cracks, and the ice was taking on a different consistency as it began to melt under the concentrated heat. Phase 2, he announced. We need to create the directional channels now, before the thermal pressure builds too high. This was the most dangerous part of the operation. They were essentially standing on top of a growing thermal bomb, using primitive tools to carve channels that would control a massive release of pressure and superheated water. One miscalculation could turn their escape attempt into a scalding death trap. Working in shifts to minimize exposure to the dangerous heat buildup, they carved precise channels in the ice ceiling that would direct the geyser effect upward and outward. Torgen's understanding of structural engineering proved invaluable, while Jax's scouting had identified the perfect weak points to target. Steam pressure is building rapidly, Quintar reported from his monitoring station. According to my calculations, we have perhaps 30 minutes before the thermal pressure reaches critical levels. Marcus nodded grimly. Then, we finish the preparations and trigger the breach. Everyone needs to be in the reinforced shelter area when this happens. The initial eruption is going to be violent. They completed the final preparations with minutes to spare, sealing themselves into the heavily reinforced corner of the chamber they had prepared. Marcus held the improvised triggering device, a carefully calibrated thermal lance that would create the final breach in the ice floor. "Is everyone ready?" he asked, looking around at the alien faces that had become so familiar over the past hours. Fear was evident in their expressions, but so was trust. They believed in his plan, in human ingenuity, in the idea that even the most impossible situations could be solved through creativity and determination. "Do it," Zira said simply. Marcus activated the thermal lance. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Superheated water and steam erupted from the floor with tremendous force, creating a vertical geyser that shot upward through the carefully carved channels in the ceiling. The sound was deafening, like the planet itself was screaming as tons of ice and rock were blasted away by the tremendous thermal pressure. The chamber filled with steam and the roar of moving water as the artificial geyser carved its way toward the surface. Marcus could feel the entire cavern system shaking under the assault of forces that had been millions of years in the making, now released in a matter of minutes. "It's working," Torgen shouted over the chaos. "The ceiling is giving way exactly as calculated." Through the steam and debris, Marcus could see daylight beginning to filter down from above. Their escape route was opening, carved by the planet's own thermal energy, turned into a tool of liberation. But they weren't free yet. They still had to survive the ride to the surface on a geyser of superheated water and steam. "Link arms," Marcus commanded. "We go up together or not at all." The group formed a human and alien chain, holding tightly to each other as the thermal updraft created by the geyser began to lift them from the chamber floor. It was like riding a vertical river of steam and scalding mist, terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. As they rose through the shaft carved by the artificial geyser, Marcus caught glimpses of Professor Vextai's monitoring equipment built into the cavern walls. Cameras and sensors that had been recording their every move, treating them like laboratory specimens rather than intelligent beings deserving of respect and basic safety. The professor was about to learn that humans didn't make good test subjects. They had a disturbing tendency to refuse to follow the experimental parameters. They burst from the planet's surface in a tower of steam and spray, the artificial geyser carrying them up into the frigid air of Glacialis Prime before depositing them on solid ground near the landing platform where their shuttle had first arrived. As the geyser subsided and the immediate danger passed, Marcus found himself lying on the ice, gasping for breath and marveling at the fact that they were all still alive. Around him, his fellow students were picking themselves up, alien features showing amazement, gratitude, and a new understanding of what human determination could accomplish when properly motivated. "Impossible," came a familiar voice. They turned to see Professor Vextai emerging from a concealed observation station, his crystalline features showing something Marcus had never seen before, genuine surprise. "My calculations indicated that escape from the cavern system was statistically impossible with the available resources and technological limitations." Marcus stood up slowly, water still dripping from his clothes and steam rising from his body in the cold air. "That's your mistake, Professor. You treated us like specimens in a controlled experiment. But we're not specimens. We're intelligent beings with our own agenda." The crystalline professor approached cautiously, as if seeing the students for the first time as something other than research subjects. "How did you? The thermodynamics alone should have made such an escape attempt suicidal. We combined our species' unique knowledge and capabilities," Marcus replied, gesturing to the diverse group around him. "Human engineering, Kepler crystalline expertise, Torgen structural knowledge, Gexka thermal dynamics, JAXA reconnaissance, quintar atmospheric calculations. Together, we were more than the sum of our parts. Marcus could see the professor processing this information, trying to understand how his carefully controlled experiment had gone so spectacularly wrong. The crystalline had expected the stress to break them down, to reveal the weaknesses and limitations of their various species. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger. Your experiment failed, Professor, Marcus continued, because you fundamentally misunderstood what you were studying. You wanted to see how different species respond to impossible stress. But what you actually discovered is that impossible situations become possible when diverse intelligences work together toward a common goal. The other students moved to stand beside Marcus, no longer separated by species barriers or academic hierarchies. They had become a unified group, bound together by shared adversity and mutual respect. Professor Vextai's diamond eyes reflected the light of the artificial geyser still steaming behind them. Perhaps, he said slowly, there are lessons here that I had not anticipated. Marcus smiled, feeling the satisfaction of a problem solved and a challenge overcome. That's the thing about humans, Professor. We're always full of surprises, especially when people underestimate us. As rescue shuttles began arriving, summoned by the spectacular thermal eruption that had announced their escape to monitoring stations across the planet, Marcus reflected on what they had accomplished. They had turned a death trap into a demonstration of interspecies cooperation, used primitive tools and human ingenuity to overcome impossible odds, and proven that the galaxy's newest species had something unique to contribute to the cosmic community. The HFY story was complete, but Marcus suspected it was only the beginning of humanity's reputation for refusing to accept the impossible.